very much, Chris, for the intro. I didn't write that, by the way, guys, but I do believe in jargon-free cybersecurity, and I'm going a little bit rogue today, given that this is a compliance room. I'm going to talk about the bits that I think we don't talk about when it comes to securing IoT devices. So just quickly, Secarma, we've got a stand upstairs. We're a nice, friendly, approachable group. So I want to talk today about, the parts of IoT solutions that we're not thinking about. So recently, I think we've got, albeit marginally, better at thinking about security in the devices that we have in our hands. The part that we're not talking about is actually everything that underpins that application and actually where that data lives. So we've seen movements from government, from other regulatory organisations, to ask us to start thinking about how we protect consumers and how we protect these devices from attacks. There's quite a lot of regulatory attention about those devices, and we've got some guides and best practices now for how we do that. Whether our industry is quite caught up with following those guides is a different question, but the guides exist. And I truly believe we've missed a bit. So the bit above the surface and the bit we're paying attention to are the devices, but actually underneath those devices we're sending sensitive, critical data to a series of apps, which are then sending data for storage via APIs that maybe we don't control into cloud solutions. And whilst those solutions by wording are included in lots of the standards and guidance, we're not actually thinking about those in the depth that we need to. So a recent example from this year, where a series of smart grow lights were exploited via the cloud solution that stored the data. So these devices weren't hacked, if you like, themselves. The actual cloud solution where those bits of information were stored is what was compromised. And I say compromised, it wasn't compromised, it was left wide open with the door unlocked. It was an S3 bucket that had no security around it, so a very low-skilled attacker was able to go and look in, pick up the data, and actually had access to 2.7 billion records, including things like Wi-Fi passwords. So they were able to use that data, which it had taken them no time at all to gather, to then move laterally amongst businesses that were using these grow lights. And I think it, for me, highlights that we're missing probably the biggest piece of the puzzle when we're talking about IoT security. So the ICO have recently released some guidance around IoT security, and it does place a little bit of emphasis now on applications and cloud storage. So you've got to implement, in quotes, appropriate security measures. And it does go into some detail about what you need to do, but in my opinion, it doesn't talk in the right language to an industry of entrepreneurs and engineers that are developing these things. It talks to people who are already familiar with security. So I do think we need to do better. It does also now place the emphasis on developers and manufacturers to look across the entire ecosystem, not just the device that you're placing in the hands of the customer. And it talks about apps mustn't undermine security. Well, actually, at the minute, apps very much, in my opinion, are undermining security, especially when you look at the volume of devices that are available to the UK from, how do I put this, other countries that maybe aren't taking security quite as seriously, where we're still being asked to download those apps and to, pass our data into those apps. And actually, there's no requirement for them to have any kind of testing at the moment. We talk about privacy by design and default, but actually, I don't think we've got that level of guidance and to be able to, use that in our applications. So at the moment, a lot of the regulation and guidance focuses on the consumer and consumer devices. But actually, where we're looking at business-to-business IoT solutions, when I'm talking to customers, they quite often will say, well, I don't really need to think about that. All the legislation focuses on customers and consumer devices and consumer data. Why would I take this kind of stuff seriously? And actually, supply chain risk is becoming huge in the media. Our friends on the high street and our car manufacturers have really helped with the message that actually we need to look at our supply chains in a lot more detail. And I do predict, using my crystal ball of predictability, that in the next couple of years, if you're supplying smart devices into businesses, you're going to come under a lot more pressure from those businesses to answer questions about, you know, where that business data is going to live, and making sure that you earn the trust of customers in a way that now you've got to earn trust through good functionality. I do foresee that there's going to be a lot more emphasis placed on security as well. Reputational and operational resilience is going to become huge. You've seen the impact that the Jaguar Land Rover attack had on their supply chain, and you know, there's a huge scramble now to save those businesses that are reliant on Jaguar Land Rover as their sole customers. So reputational and operational resilience is going to become more of a factor, and actually that's dependent on having good security practices, not just on the device, but where the data is stored, so you're not going to become one of those stories that I put up on slide number 1. Your investors are also going to want to know about cybersecurity measures, and how, you know, their reputation and their money is not going to be sat there in an insecure S3 bucket that I can't believe still exists, with all we know about with the cloud right now. So I just wanted to play a little game. If any of you have got children, you'll have played Top Trumps before. So I want to play some cyber attack Top Trumps. And I want to talk to you about how attackers can compromise apps and therefore the devices associated with them. Now, I've not done a pen test for about 10 years, which is why I put my notes in, but I'm going to wing it. So if I'm given slightly incorrect information, you can come and tell me off upstairs. But I'm going to cross my fingers. Okay, so the first tactic that I want to look at is mobile app reverse engineering. And for each of these attacks, I've got a couple of examples. I want to have a look at actually how easy it is to do, what resources you need, what level of experience you need as an attacker to do it, and what the impact might possibly be. And these are 4 really common examples that we come across as pen testers. I say we, the royal we, that we come across as pen testers all the time. So reverse engineering is essentially using a decompiler, which is a piece of software that translates, it translates what you've built back into its original code, so you can see all the features and how it works. Now, by doing that, you can uncover key information that allows you to compromise the device that's sending data to the app. And you can do that by extracting hard-coded secrets. So you're going to have API tokens and credentials written into that code in more instances than you would care to believe. You'll be able to understand the communication protocol, so you'll be able to understand the methods of data transmission, which will allow you to spy on that data. You'll be able to figure out potentially how the authentication system works, and therefore you'll be able to game that authentication system. You can also, from looking at the URLs that are in the code, you'll be able to tell what APIs are in use, so what third parties are interacting with the application. And you can therefore use that information to tamper with the app behavior. So you can ask the app actually to always allow your IP address to log in without authentication. So that's just some of the examples of how you can use reverse engineering. So here's its Top Trumps card. So the tooling for this is widely available. It's open source, which means that as a hacker, you actually don't need any cache resources to be able to do this. You do need a bit of moderate programming experience. When I say moderate, I'm probably talking 3 to 5 years of programming experience, so it's not hugely unattainable. This can be done mostly offline, so you're fairly undetectable while you're reverse engineering apps. and we reckon it's about 1 to 2 days of effort. So when you're thinking about a hacker and whether you're worth attacking, we hear that quite a lot. Well, we've not got valuable data. Why would they spend lots of time trying to get into our app? But actually, if this only takes 1 to 2 days, that's not a huge time investment. And the impact is potentially hijacking devices at scale. If I compromise one instance of your device by attacking the device itself, I've possibly got access to one business or one consumer's data. If I can hijack your app, I can do a fleet-wide hijack, and therefore it's much more impactful. So I was giving this one a medium score, a 7 out of 10. So because I need a little bit of skill to do it, that's why I'm going to give it 7 out of 10. So moving on to the next method. So API exposure. So this is where APIs that are being used to transmit data or to, pass data between different providers is essentially observed, if you like. So using poor authentication. So if I'm not asking for strong credentials to be able to connect to that API, or if I'm using hard-coded or leaked credentials within the API calls as well. So you can use URLs to actually fathom how the API authenticates users, and you can pass a different user token or even one that already exists but isn't yours and you shouldn't have access to. You can figure out the structure of that string to be able to use that API for your own purposes. You can use it for ID guessing or enumeration, so that's by looking at those patterns in those URLs. You can use it to fake an ID, you can use it to fake an authentication, so the API developer can't tell that you are who you say you are, they think you're a trusted user. You can use overexposed functions, so if you've left API functions that are used for things like debugging, you'll be able to enumerate lots of information about how that API works using explicit error messages, for example. So you can make the API deliberately fail so that you can get information about how that API runs checks, for example, on your authentication. So API scorecard, we scored that one slightly higher. So the tooling is open source, you can do it with a browser. So you don't need huge amounts of cache resources to be able to make this happen. Attacker skill can be low. You can have really basic knowledge of how to read and interpret API calls to be able to compromise an app in this way. We decided between our testing team that the time needed to actually launch this attack was a few hours. Even as a beginner, one of our juniors would be able to do this in a few hours. The impact, we decided, was data exfiltration, so we can actually use the API to pass data outside of the app itself once we know how that API works, how it authenticates, and we can pass it some fake commands. This may, depending on the architecture, allow some lateral movement through networks, so depending on where your APIs or your application's hosted, and might be quite poor segmentation there, this might allow for lateral movement. And also we figured out that we could potentially hijack devices at scale, although not as easily in the previous method. So we decided this was going to be a high, an 8 out of 10 on its scorecard. My favourite one, cloud misconfiguration. So this is the cause of the example I gave you on slide 1. Most of our apps now are hosted in the cloud, web apps or mobile apps is the same. The common cloud misconfigurations are publicly accessible services, so if you've not got a web application firewall that's going to allow all traffic through, or you've got some data storage that actually isn't restricted and doesn't require authentication. Lots of developers and lots of businesses who are developing mobile and web apps, especially for the first time, believe that if they host something in the cloud, that cloud provider has done the security for them, and that's just not correct. Amazon buckets are still open by default in a lot of cases, and those hardening guides exist, but they're not always used. So So weak authentication, passwords and authentication methods are only as good as what you ask the cloud provider to check for. We see really common problems with overly permissive roles. So if you're allowing kind of service accounts to access the data, you end up accidentally exposing data that shouldn't be exposed. Poor network segmentation, so even in the cloud, you should still have those physical barriers between your public-facing application services and your internal business functions as well. Because if one is compromised, it's really easy then for an attacker to move between that if you've not got the right kind of segmentation. Misconfigured logging and monitoring, so if you've got logs that are either being stored in open buckets, you're essentially giving away how your application works, how your authentication works. So because the tooling is free and because you can use search engines to detect publicly facing buckets, we decided that this was a very high risk potential compromise. As an attacker, you need some basic networking knowledge and you need some familiarity with the cloud service that you're going to be attacking. We again decided this was going to be a matter of hours, so this is a really high risk, high impact type of attack. And the impact was going to be data exfiltration, potentially widespread service disruption. So, if you're in somebody's cloud infrastructure, it's a click of a button to take that infrastructure offline altogether. And that we could also use this to hijack devices at scale. The last one we talked about was poor session management. So sessions are when you log into an application or a device, you're given a session on that application. That session says that you are who you say you are for that period of time that you are logged into that device. Those sessions can be hijacked. So you can intercept traffic with some easily downloadable open source tools to manipulate how that application manages your session. And that's through a series of things like token leakage, where if you don't transmit that token in a way that makes it unreadable, it's really easy to create a token that looks exactly like it should do for your application. If you're not storing your session data securely, so you're not storing who the user was, where they logged in from, if you're not storing that securely, that can also be read and fed back into your application. So you might look like you've logged in as a specific user who regularly logs into the application. Actually, it's not you at all. You're just almost stealing their digital identity for that period of time on that application. We decided that session management scored a medium. So the tools that you use to do this they do cost, but they are very low cost. The attacker skill, if you've got some knowledge about how sessions work and how authentication works and you understand what tokens look like, actually this is quite easy to do. I remember doing my pen test certifications. This was one of the things we had to do, was a session hijack where we used Burp Suite to interpret traffic, manipulate it, and then pass it back to the application. It's not hard to do. We decided it would take about a day to be able to figure this out as somebody who has that moderate skill level, and that the impact of that is full device control of the device that we hijacked the session from. So maybe not necessarily fleet-wide hijack at this point, but for that one device, this could be pretty impactful. So why have I gone through all this top trumps? I'm trying to make a point here that actually this stuff isn't difficult, and most pen testing juniors or people who've got those digital skills are able to run these attacks if you're not covering the basics of application and cloud security. It's low skill, it's low effort, and for me this forms the biggest risk to those solutions that you're selling into businesses and that you're selling to consumers. So how do we defend the app? So for me, the key is to make sure that you're considering security at all parts of the development cycle. So too often we see devices created, solutions created, big round of testing, and then they're pushed out onto the market. that is a patchy way, and an expensive way actually, of applying security retrospectively to something that you've built. So during design phase, you should really be threat modelling. So use some of the really common threat modelling frameworks. They're really quite detailed. Use those to risk assess before you've built anything, before you've written a single line of code, what could go wrong with your design. And by doing that exercise, not only will you create a better quality product, but you'll also make sure that at the end of the development cycle, when you're doing your kind of pre-release testing, that testing can be much more focused because you've already got that understanding of where the vulnerabilities could be. Train your developers. So many businesses assume that because their developers are in tech, they have an awareness of security. That for me is like going into a hospital and asking the plastic surgeon to operate on your brain. It's just a different field, and you would never have that expectation. So make sure that your developers are given some cross-training on security. It's so important. During production, make sure that you're doing your cloud configuration reviews. So if you're not able to do them yourself, get somebody to check it. Get somebody to check it anyway, because actually, I think the phrase is no one says their own baby's ugly. If you've built something, you're going to think it's right. Having that extra view of, yes, actually, it's definitely been done correctly, is so valuable. When you come to pre-release, make sure you do your penetration testing and you're getting your apps certified and you're getting your devices certified. So penetration testing is the act of an organisation with no malicious intent explaining to you how a hacker could get into your solution and the impact that that could have. So as a manufacturer, that for me is gold, because I already understand ahead of time how my device could be compromised, and I can put some mitigations in place before that goes to market. After you're releasing, you're probably going to be refining that product, you're probably going to be updating it. Make sure that you have a regular vulnerability scanning program and a regular pen testing program, because actually new vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. So at Secarma, we discover zero-day vulnerabilities on client products almost monthly. So it's a regularly updating landscape. So it's not okay to just do one test and step back and say, oh no, well, it was secure in 2010. This moves so quickly, you've got to have an ongoing program. Now, pen testing all year isn't cost effective, but vulnerability scanning is. That will test your device against known vulnerabilities, and pen testing will pick up those bits that aren't already known. That's how I would describe the difference. So I just want to introduce really quickly a project that Secarma have worked on with the Police Secure by Design scheme to actually allow app developers to certify that an application has met some baseline security controls. So it's not to demonstrate that your app is absolutely infallible, but it's to say that you've actually met that. Here's what we consider to be the baseline of security for apps. It validates protection against some really common threats and some of the attacks that I've gone through in my little top trumps exercise. And it's suitable for all types of applications. So even if the application isn't associated with an IoT device and it's kind of, just something standalone, then that app can be tested. And it's a penetration test, so we actually explore the app and we let you know what could have been compromised or what we could do with it, and actually then how you can fix it. But at the end of it, you've got, and this is something that's really important to me, you get a certificate that you can show to a customer who's non-technical to say, look, we've met all these requirements. Pen test reports can be quite difficult to read if you've not got the skills to interpret what they mean. They're just kind of here's all the things we've found. The so what can be quite difficult if you're a procurement person trying to buy it or you're not quite sure what to look for. For me, having a certification scheme means that you can hand over something that says I've met a certain level, and that allows a non-technical person to be able to read and interpret that. Chris, I've done my best to get us back on time to speak really quickly, but thank you very much for listening, guys. And if you do have any questions, feel free to pop upstairs, and with a big, massive purple stand, you can't miss us. We're right in the way of the nice view.